In this video, we are going to learn how to polar align this smart telescope, the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 2, and so we'll be able to use it in equatorial mode to avoid a phenomenon that is called field rotation. So let me go a bit more into the details. First, if you're not aware, the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 2 is a fairly cheap smart telescope. It costs around $500 and you can control it via smartphone. It will happily use its motors to point to targets automatically, track them throughout the sky, and even take images of them. While it's taking images of them, it can do what we call light accumulation or live stacking, where it takes many images of the same target and it keeps stacking on top of the previous images until we get a better and better and clearer image. It's great for what we call deep sky astrophotography or deep sky astronomy, which is looking at galaxies and nebulae and star clusters, that kind of stuff. I've done a full tutorial about how to use this little telescope as a full self-contained astrophotography platform, and I'll put the link both down in the description as well as up above. I'll also have in the description a link to buy this telescope if you're interested in it. Now, why would you need to put the telescope in equatorial mode? Because overall, the telescope, when you first use it, you'll typically put it like this. It's going to be horizontal, basically on a tripod, and it will be able to move horizontally on one axis and then vertically on the other axis, thus able to point anywhere in the sky and to also follow the stars as they move across the sky as the Earth rotates. No problem, right? That said, if you try to do light accumulation on a target for, let's say, an hour long, or even like 10-20 minutes long, you'll begin to see a phenomenon that's called field rotation. And it will manifest as those weird corners that you see on the image on your screen now. And this is because while you are following the target as it moves across the sky, the target itself is rotating. And by being in this, what we call alt-azimuth configuration, meaning one axis horizontal, one axis vertical movement, then we're not able to keep track of that rotation. And so we get this field rotation. I mean, a very simple example is, think about if you've ever looked at the constellation Cassiopeia, the one that does kind of like a W in the sky, except sometimes it's an M in the sky. And if you look at it at the start of the night versus the end of the night, you'll notice that it was maybe a W at the start and an M at the end, or vice versa. And that's because it rotated around the celestial pole. And so placing the telescope in what we call equatorial mode would actually make it point towards the almost the North Star in my hemisphere. And this video, I'm really sorry, will be mostly for people in the northern hemisphere. And if I'm able to point the telescope towards, kind of like to have it angled so that its axis is parallel to the Earth's rotation axis, then naturally, as the telescope will follow target, it will only need to be able to move this axis here. By doing so, it can follow any target. If it's pointed to a target, doing so will just follow the target. It doesn't need to use both axes, and at the same time, the lens at the top is actually kind of rotating compared to the horizontal. And so it will follow the rotation of our targets, which is perfect and which is what we want. The first step to doing the polar alignment and putting this telescope in equatorial mode is to actually find the rotation axis of the Earth. And for that, in the northern hemisphere, and I'm really sorry for southern hemisphere people where it's less easy, but I'll focus on the northern hemisphere for now. In the northern hemisphere, you can simply find the star called Polaris, which is towards the north. The easiest way to do that is to start with a compass. Look where the north is located on your compass, and you can look at an angle in the sky roughly equal to your latitude. So I'm at 36 degrees roughly latitude, so for me Polaris will be towards the north at an angle compared to the horizon of 36 degrees. If you're in Paris, I think it's around 46, 7, I don't quite remember, and you'll have to follow this latitude. So it's fairly straightforward, but in very light polluted cities like here in Tokyo, Polaris can be very faint actually compared to the sky background and hard to find. So in that case, my favorite solution is to use the constellation of the Big Dipper, which is usually quite visible. And there are two stars in the square that it makes called Merak and Dubhe. You can follow the line that they make all the way to Polaris. So it's fairly easy then to find it. Okay, so now you've found Polaris. If you found Polaris, then you can actually align the telescope parallel to the Earth's rotation axis. So to do so, there are several methods. If Polaris is right behind this telescope, we want to really orient it this way. So what we'll want to do is so that this axis here is basically rotating the same way as the Earth. So we'll basically rotate in the opposite direction that the Earth rotates, and the dwarf telescope will do that automatically. And this axis here will be to point to a target. Now, obviously, doing so restricts the targets that we can point to, because I cannot point like horizontally towards the horizon because the lenses start getting hidden. And this gets worse at lower latitudes. So how do I point this telescope like that to Polaris? First, we need a pointing methodology. We need to be able to find where Polaris is located in relationship to the scope. There are three methods for that. One of them would be to take a straw. So here I have a bit of straw, and then using like tape or whatever, you can affix it to the side of the telescope. And you want to make sure that it is as parallel as possible to the telescope side. So not crooked like this, but quite parallel, like roughly this, right? And then you'll be able to use the straw as a sighting tube to search for Polaris. And the final objective will be to put Polaris at the center of your straw's field of view. Because the straw can have a very limited field of view, a fat straw might be good. And another possibility is if you have access to a 3D printer or someone who has a 3D printer, someone made a model of an adapter that you can put on the side of the telescope, and it has a little target thing at the center, and I can just slot it in like this, and then I can use this as the sight tube instead rather than a straw that I have affixed to it. And the last method would be doesn't require anything on the side of the telescope. It simply requires to start with the telescope lens pointed exactly up. And it so happens that there are small marks, at least on my telescope here and there, and you want to align the lenses as precisely as possible to those marks. Once that's done, you can connect to the telescope via the smartphone app, as always, and then you'll be able to use that to sight Polaris in exactly the same way as the straw or as the 3D printed targets. Okay, so now we know how we can sight Polaris. And the next step is you want to put the telescope on a tripod, not the tripod that comes with the dwarf lamp telescope, because that one is too small and it will not be able to carry the telescope at an angle like we've been doing. So you want to get a cheap tripod. This is a very cheap tripod, but like something that has fairly long tripod legs, so it will be stable as you angle the telescope down. And then you want to angle the tripod head so that the direction where you can move the telescope like that at an angle is pointing roughly towards Polaris. So that would be like this for me, okay? And you want to use only the tripod to center Polaris in your sight tube or the field of view of your telescope. If you're using the third technique of directly using the telescope, you don't want to be moving the axis of the telescope. The telescope axis, both the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, need to be exactly as you set them up. No movement, okay? So you don't touch the telescope axis, whether it is within the application or manually. All of the manipulations will be done using the tripod. And so I'll be using my tripod head with like my sighting adapter here, and I'll be okay. I want to get to Polaris. Okay, Polaris is more or less here, or for you, you could be using the lenses and the app. And if Polaris is a bit to the right, okay, I'll go or to the left, I'll go this direction. I use only the tripod controls. Now, with a cheap tripod like this one, it can be quite painful, but if you have a slightly better tripod with a tripod head that has like horizontal movement and movement lock, it becomes much easier. So you need to be very careful, very relaxed about it, and have patience. And after a while, you'll see Polaris enter the field of view of your straw, of your 3D printed adapter, or of the lens at the top. Once you have Polaris roughly centered, you want to make sure that you lock the smart telescope in place, and now it is going to be pointed to Polaris via the sighting tube or via directly the lens at the top. You've used only the tripod, and if you've managed to do that, well, congratulations, your telescope is now roughly parallel to the Earth's rotation axis. The next step is to just use the telescope completely normally. So I would turn on the telescope, I would put the lenses roughly in this direction to a part of the sky that I know is visible, have the telescope in the home position as it is now, and then the telescope can do its normal calibration routine, where it will first point like 20 degrees to the left, go back to center, 20 degrees to the right, go back to the center, and then it will know, after having analyzed the stars that it looked at, what angle it is placed at and how to track the stars. After that, you just use it as normal in the app. And you'll notice that when you do the stacking, you will not be seeing that field rotation anymore, assuming that you've properly pointed this axis towards Polaris, or basically to make it parallel to the Earth's rotation axis. This movement there will be countering the Earth's rotation to track the stars. So the telescope now needs to move only this motor to track the stars instead of having to move both motors. It's a very efficient kind of position, and because the telescope is so light, it doesn't need any things like counterweights or that kind of stuff. Did you find this useful? If you did, leave a like, leave a comment down below with tips and tricks that you could have about the equatorial alignment of the Dwarf Lab Dwarf 2 telescope. If you're interested in buying it and supporting me, I'll have links in the description to that little telescope. And don't forget, if you can, to subscribe, and if you're feeling very generous, you can support me on my Patreon or by joining the YouTube channel. Everything helps, and thank you so much for all of my channel members and my Patreon to really make this channel possible. With that, that's it for tonight. Don't forget, whenever you can, to look up at the stars, and I'll see you next time.